She wore a thrifted coat to her cousin's engagement party. They laughed, they pointed, they called her the family embarrassment in front of 200 guests. Nobody knew that the same woman they humiliated was about to pick up her phone, make one call, and end the $600 million deal that was supposed to save their entire company right there in front of everyone. Her name was Alina Voss, though almost nobody in that ballroom would have recognized the name if they'd heard it. To her family, she was simply the poor cousin, the one who never quite fit in, the one whose photos never made it onto the mantelpiece next to the others. She had grown up differently than the rest of them. Her parents had died when she was young, and she had been raised by her grandmother in a small house on the edge of town, far from the marble floors and manicured lawns of the Caldwell estate. The Caldwells were her mother's side of the family, wealthy, proud, and deeply concerned with appearances. When Alina's grandmother passed away during her college years, the family had offered her nothing more than a stiff, obligatory condolence card. No visit, no support. Just distance and the quiet understanding that she was not really one of them. She had built her life from nothing after that. Nobody watched her do it because nobody cared to look. While the Caldwells spent their weekends golfing and hosting charity galas that were really just excuses to be photographed, Alina worked. She waited tables during the day and studied finance at night. She slept 4 hours some nights and none on others. She learned to read markets the way other people read novels, cover to cover, obsessively, searching for patterns hidden in the noise. By the time she was 26, she had quietly built an investment fund that outperformed almost everyone on Wall Street. By 30, that fund had grown into something enormous, a firm called Voss Capital Group, a name she had chosen deliberately because it wasn't her family's name. It was hers alone. She never told the Caldwells what she had become. Not out of shame, but because she had learned long ago that their approval was never something she needed, and their sudden interest, if it ever came, would only come because of what she had, not who she was. So she stayed quiet. She wore simple clothes, drove an old car, and let her old family believe exactly what they wanted to believe, that she was still the same struggling girl who never amounted to much. It was easier that way. It was safer. And in truth, some private part of her almost enjoyed watching them underestimate her, the same way people underestimate a storm gathering quietly on the horizon. The invitation to Priscilla's engagement party came as a surprise, delivered through a text message rather than a proper card, as if it were an afterthought stitched onto the end of a much bigger celebration. Priscilla was Harold Caldwell's daughter, the golden child of the family, engaged now to a young man from another wealthy dynasty. The wedding itself would come later, extravagant and photographed for magazines, but this engagement party was meant to be the first spectacle, the unveiling of Priscilla's perfect life to everyone who mattered. Alina almost didn't go. She had no interest in standing in a room full of people who had spent years reminding her, in small and large ways, that she didn't belong. But something told her to attend anyway, not for the free champagne or the empty conversation, but because she already knew something the rest of the room didn't. 3 days earlier, in a glass-walled office 40 floors above the city, Alina had reviewed a partnership request that had crossed her desk at Voss Capital. It was a massive deal worth just over $600 million, meant to rescue a struggling company from the edge of collapse by merging it with a much larger firm. The struggling company's name had stopped her cold when she first read it. It belonged to Harold Caldwell. She had spent that afternoon reading through internal reports nobody outside the company was supposed to see, reports about unpaid overtime, about employees pressured into resigning without severance, about numbers quietly shifted around to make the company look healthier than it actually was. It was the kind of quiet cruelty that never made headlines, the kind that hurt real people slowly over months and years, while the man at the top gave speeches about loyalty and family values. Alina had seen enough of that kind of cruelty in her own life to recognize it instantly when it showed up in a spreadsheet. She had not signed the deal. She hadn't even sent a rejection letter through the usual channels. She had simply told her team to pause everything quietly without explanation, while she decided exactly how she wanted this to unfold. And when the invitation to Priscilla's party arrived, she understood immediately that fate, or perhaps just cruel timing, was offering her a stage she hadn't asked for. The night of the party, the hotel ballroom shimmered under gold light. Chandeliers threw soft reflections across polished floors, and a live quartet played somewhere near the back, barely audible over 200 overlapping conversations. Guests arrived in gowns that cost more than most people's rent, in suits tailored so precisely they looked like a second skin. Laughter rippled through the room in practiced waves, the kind of laughter that exists mostly to be seen rather than felt. Alina arrived quietly, wearing a simple navy dress and flat shoes, her hair pulled back without any of the elaborate styling the other women had clearly spent hours on. She didn't need a grand entrance. She never had. The whispers began almost as soon as she stepped through the door. "Is that really her?" someone murmured near the bar, barely bothering to lower her voice. "I didn't think she'd actually show up," another voice answered. "Someone should have told her there was a dress code." Priscilla, holding a glass of champagne near a cluster of friends, glanced over with a small, satisfied smile, the kind people wear when the world is behaving exactly as they expected it to. "Well," she said loudly enough for a few heads to turn, "at least she's consistent." Alina said nothing. She had heard worse from these same people for most of her life. She found a quiet spot near the edge of the room, took a glass of water instead of champagne, and waited. The evening moved the way these evenings always moved: toasts, laughter, photographs, more laughter. At some point, Priscilla stood to give a speech about her fiancé, about the future they were building together, about how blessed she felt to have a family that had given her everything. As she spoke, her eyes drifted briefly toward Alina, and her tone shifted just slightly, sweetly cruel in the way only family can manage. "Not everyone gets that," she said, smiling. "Some people just don't have the same drive, I suppose, but that's okay. We still love you, cousin, even if you never quite figured out how to make something of yourself." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. Alina simply smiled back, calm and unreadable, the same way she had learned to smile in boardrooms full of men who underestimated her before she opened her mouth. Then Harold Caldwell stood, tapping his glass with a fork until the room quieted. He was a tall man, silver-haired, with the kind of confidence that came from never once being told no. Tonight he seemed particularly pleased with himself, practically glowing as he raised his glass. "I want to share something with all of you," he said, his voice booming with pride. "As most of you know, my company has been through some challenges this past year, but I'm thrilled to announce that we've secured a partnership, an incredible one, worth over $600 million. This deal is going to change everything for us. It's going to secure this family's future for generations." Applause erupted. Someone whistled. Priscilla clapped the loudest, beaming at her father as though he had just handed her the moon. Harold soaked it in, nodding graciously, glancing around the room to make sure everyone understood the magnitude of what he had just said. Alina stood near the back, quiet, holding her glass of water, watching the celebration unfold with an expression that gave nothing away. She knew something none of them did. She knew that deal did not exist anymore. She had made sure of that 3 days ago. And she had decided, standing there in that ballroom full of people who thought they knew exactly who she was, that tonight was the night the truth would come out, not through gossip, not through a headline months later, but from her own voice in this very room. She waited until the applause settled, until Harold sat back down, glowing with the kind of pride that comes right before a fall. Then she reached into her small handbag, pulled out her phone, and calmly stood. "Actually," she said, her voice quiet but clear enough to cut through the remaining chatter, "I think there's something everyone should hear." A few heads turned, mildly annoyed at the interruption, expecting some awkward, forgettable comment from the family's least significant member. Priscilla rolled her eyes. Harold barely glanced her way, but Alina didn't sit down. She dialed a number, put the call on speaker, and held the phone up just slightly, letting the ringing tone fill the sudden pocket of silence that had formed around her. The call connected on the second ring. A composed, professional voice answered instantly. Ms. Voss, we were just discussing the Caldwell file. Should I proceed with sending the formal cancellation notice tonight? The room went quiet in a way it hadn't all evening. Yes, Alina said calmly, her eyes steady on Harold's face as it slowly shifted from confusion to something closer to dread. Send it tonight, effective immediately. Let his board know the reasons are documented in case they have questions. Understood, the voice replied. I'll have it out within the hour. Alina ended the call and slipped the phone back into her bag as casually as if she had just confirmed a dinner reservation. The silence in the room had a texture to it now, heavy and confused, guests glancing at each other, unsure what they had just witnessed. Harold's face had gone pale. What was that?" he asked, his voice suddenly smaller than it had been minutes ago. "That," Alina said quietly, "was me canceling your deal." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through a few confused guests, the kind of laughter people produce when they're not sure if something is a joke. Priscilla frowned, looking between her father and her cousin. "What are you talking about?" "That doesn't make any sense. You don't even work in finance." Alina turned to her, and for the first time that evening, her voice carried a weight the room hadn't heard from her before. "I'm the CEO of Voss Capital Group," she said simply. "That $600 million deal your father was celebrating, it came across my desk 3 days ago. I reviewed it myself. And when I saw how your company has been treating its employees, the unpaid overtime, the people pushed out without severance, the numbers quietly rearranged to hide how bad things really are, I decided I wasn't going to be part of it." The room had gone completely still now, the kind of stillness that swallows even the sound of ice shifting in glasses. Somewhere near the back, a phone buzzed and a guest glanced down at it, eyes widening as a news alert flashed across the screen, the same news Alina had just delivered in person, now confirmed in print. That's not possible," Harold stammered, his composure cracking in front of the very crowd he'd spent the evening trying to impress. "Voss Capital doesn't. I never met you, I never even knew, you never asked," Alina said simply. "None of you ever asked what I actually did with my life. You decided a long time ago who I was, and you never once thought to check if you were right." Priscilla's face had drained of color, her earlier smugness replaced by something closer to panic. "This is insane," she said, laughing nervously, though nobody around her joined in. "You're lying. There's no way someone like you, someone like me," Alina repeated softly, cutting her off not with anger but with a calm, steady certainty that somehow felt heavier than shouting ever could. "You've been saying that phrase about me since I was 17 years old. Someone like me doesn't deserve a seat at your table. Someone like me embarrasses the family. Someone like me will never amount to anything." She paused, letting the words settle over the crowd. "I built a company worth more than everything in this room combined, and I did it without a single one of you noticing, because none of you ever looked past the clothes I was wearing." Nobody spoke. Somewhere near the bar, a waiter froze mid-step, tray balanced carefully, clearly unsure whether to keep moving or stand still and witness whatever was unfolding. Harold sat back down heavily, his earlier triumphant posture completely gone, replaced by the stooped shoulders of a man watching his carefully built image collapse in real time. "Why?" he asked quietly, almost to himself. "Why would you do this here, tonight, in front of everyone?" Alina considered the question for a moment, genuinely considering it because it deserved a real answer. "Because you did the same thing to your employees that you and this family have done to me for years," she said. "You take people who trust you, who depend on you, and you decide their worth without ever really seeing them. You build them up just enough to use them, and when they're no longer convenient, you throw them away and call it business. I wasn't going to let that happen to hundreds of people just so this family could throw a bigger party." A woman near the front, someone Alina didn't recognize, likely a business associate of Harold's, spoke up hesitantly. "Is this true about the employees?" "Every word," Alina said. "It's all documented. It'll be public soon enough if it isn't already." Another guest near the back lowered his phone slowly, having clearly just confirmed the story himself. "She's telling the truth," he said quietly to the person beside him. "It's already on the financial news sites." The party, which had begun as a celebration of wealth and success, had transformed into something closer to a courtroom, with Alina standing calmly at its center and Harold and Priscilla sitting exposed under the same chandeliers that had minutes earlier glowed in celebration of a deal that no longer existed. Alina didn't gloat, she didn't raise her voice or smile in satisfaction. She simply looked around the room one final time at faces that had spent years mocking her, laughing at her clothes, calling her a disappointment behind cupped hands and painted smiles. "I didn't come here tonight to embarrass anyone," she said finally. "I came because I wanted to see one last time how this family treats someone they think has nothing. And now you all know exactly what I have. I hope it was worth it." With that, she turned and walked toward the exit. Her footsteps steady against the marble floor, the murmurs behind her rising into a low, confused roar as guests turned to each other, some already pulling out phones to search her name, others whispering apologies they should have said years earlier, apologies that now felt hollow and far too late. In the weeks that followed, the fallout unfolded exactly as anyone might expect. Harold's company, already struggling, lost what little confidence its remaining partners had left. Without the merger, the debts that had been quietly hidden came due, and the business that once seemed untouchable began to crumble in slow, painful stages. Employees who had once feared speaking out suddenly found their stories being taken seriously, their complaints validated by outside investigators who arrived once the story broke publicly. Priscilla's engagement, once the talk of every society page, faded quietly from conversation as her family's name became associated with scandal rather than success. The wedding, originally planned as an even bigger spectacle than the party, was quietly postponed and then never rescheduled at all. Alina, meanwhile, returned to her quiet life exactly as it had been before: modest apartment, simple clothes, the same old car parked outside. She hadn't done what she did for recognition or revenge. She had done it because it was right, because somewhere in the pattern of cruelty she'd witnessed in that company's paperwork, she had seen a reflection of her own life, the quiet mistreatment of people considered too small to matter. Ending that deal wasn't about punishing her family. It was about refusing to let the same thing happen to hundreds of strangers who had never mocked her, never laughed at her, and never done anything to deserve what Harold's company had been doing to them. A few weeks after the party, Harold reached out. A short, stiff message asking if they could talk. Alina agreed, mostly out of curiosity rather than hope. He arrived at a quiet coffee shop looking smaller than she remembered, the confidence that once filled every room he entered now replaced by something closer to exhaustion. "I should have known you," he said quietly, staring at his coffee rather than her. "I should have asked at some point what kind of person you became. Instead, I let everyone else's opinion of you become my own." Alina studied him for a long moment. "You still could have asked," she said simply. "Nobody stopped you, you just never thought I was worth the question." He didn't argue, there was nothing left to argue. Priscilla never reached out at all, not directly. Alina heard, through distant relatives, that she had moved out of the city for a while, away from the whispers and the headlines that followed her family's collapse. Whether that distance ever turned into real reflection, Alina would probably never know and had stopped expecting to. As for Alina, she continued building what she had always been building, quietly and without applause. She began mentoring a handful of young employees inside her own company who reminded her of herself at 20, overlooked, underestimated, hungry to prove something to people who would probably never notice anyway. She made sure none of them ever had to work under the kind of quiet cruelty she'd uncovered in Harold's company. She didn't need anyone's gratitude for that, she simply needed to know it was done right. Sometimes, late in the evening, she would think back to that ballroom, the chandeliers, the laughter, the way 200 people had looked at her like she was something small and forgettable. She didn't feel triumphant when she remembered it. She felt something closer to clarity, the quiet understanding that the people who judge others the harshest are often the ones who have never bothered to look closely at all. They had spent years deciding who she was based on the coat she wore and the car she drove, never once imagining that the woman they dismissed so easily held more power in her quiet, unassuming hands than all of them combined. In the end, that was the real lesson buried underneath everything that happened that night, not the money, not the deal, not even the humiliation that had finally fully reversed itself. It was simply this: true worth doesn't announce itself, and the loudest people in any room are rarely the ones who actually hold the power. Sometimes it's the quiet ones, the ones dismissed and underestimated, who are carrying the weight of decisions that could change everything, and the world only realizes it once they finally choose to speak.